So this is the fourth video, part 4, and we're going to go into Lady Hope's life. And I find it really refreshing because as we look, she had so much fruit, and her life from a teenage girl was filled with sharing Jesus. And her, like I say, putting on her princess shoes, she certainly did, even to the point of sharing with Charles Darwin and sharing the glory of Jesus and him finding Jesus as his Savior before he died. So Lady Hope's life. Lady Hope her name was Elizabeth Reed Cotton, and she was born in 1842 in Tasmania, of all places. Her father was a General Sir Arthur Cotton, English, and he spent 40 years in India. In India, he had giant irrigation projects on the Godavari River, and these projects saved millions of lives in India. They even put up a statue to his service there. And on the statue, it said, "To a great man whose works have conferred untold benefits to the people in India." He was one of the greatest engineering geniuses the world has ever known. He was captain of the Royal Engineers and knighted later by Queen Victoria. Elizabeth was brought up in the Christian faith under the arms of her father and mother, who both loved Jesus. They were both Presbyterian, but they had missionary hearts to the people wherever they went. Don't you love this? In 1854, they're traveling to England, and she was a teenager then, and 14 passengers died of smallpox. And during that time, Elizabeth went and was praying for each one of those passengers even before they died. In 1856, her younger sister died of whooping cough. In 1859, her brother died of whooping cough. You would think that she would be very upset, thinking of losing both her sister and brother. But in the midst of all this, she started speaking more of Jesus and teaching Bible studies after the deaths of her siblings. In fact, she was encouraged by a famous family friend, a missionary named David Livingstone. Does that sound familiar? Missionary to Africa and to the darkest areas of Africa. One of the greatest missionaries, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, that he had encouraged her during this time. She also was friends with Ribron Taylor's daughter. That was her best friend, and she became a missionary and hymn writer, and they wrote hymns together. In 1861, there was a public banquet that was given for her father, and like 200 distinguished people showed up. And she was introduced to them all, and she knew them, and they knew her as this little girl sharing Jesus. Not little girl. At that time, I would say she was in her 20s, teens to 20s. And then, as they went over his brilliant achievements at that time, they all knew her as his beautiful daughter. And so she became known. Just say a lot of people knew about Elizabeth Cotton. Her family then moved to Sheffield, Ireland, which is in the county Down. And a couple, I should say, Earl Roden and Robert Josland. Now, I don't know for sure if they're a married couple, but they started a haven for the missionaries and evangelicals to come there. And so Elizabeth met many of them that had came, and she became friends of Catherine Marshall, who opened a hospital for the poor, another well-known Christian and missionary. Elizabeth then travels with her father in 1866. the star of India visits the scientists of the day. So she goes and he gives lectures to the Geographic Society. And so Elizabeth meets the scientists of that day, and they all know her. In fact, she definitely had to be introduced to Charles Darwin at that time. So her knowing the scientists, and actually, she had shared the gospel with them. They knew exactly where she stood on Jesus Christ. So back to in Dorking, which was a population of 5,400 and growing, Elizabeth began evangelistic teachings there, evangelism, I should say, and philanthropic work there in the city, which she did for the rest of her life. Her father supported her to start classes. And you know what classes she started? She started classes for girls to share the gospel. So she brought them in and giving the gospel and sharing with them how to share the gospel on the streets, and in the hospitals and in the church, wherever. So she was teaching girls. And then she started a class for wild boys that were uncared for, that were on the street. They would bring them in and come to her, and she would share the gospel and make sure that they were taken care of. These wild boys. Pretty amazing, huh? And so then her father rented a room for men to attend this coffee shop. It was where they could go and have non-alcoholic drinks, food, and hear the gospel. And so men would come, those on the street looking for hope, to their coffee shop. One of the first coffee shops, even before the Jesus movement, when we had coffee shops, they were one of the first to put together a coffee shop where people could come and have coffee and hear gospel music. Or I should say, hear the gospel. And she would read the Bible to them, and then she held prayer meetings in the coffee rooms. In fact, a young man named William Dinage, he wrote of the coffee room. And what he says, Miss Cotton conducted services at 8 a.m. on Sunday for non-church goers. She drew in large audience and was very popular. She had a pleasing and engaging manner and a silvery voice. And her message was simple, all about Jesus. Isn't that amazing? It actually gives me goosebumps right now. But anyway, she was an active Christian. In 1876, Elizabeth published the book called Our Coffee House, Our Coffee Room. And it was such a charismatic and charming bit of testimonies of men coming there and coming to the Lord and what God was doing, that a certain lady, a famous lady, was so impressed with her. She went and took copies of all of her writings to the soldiers in the Crimean War. So who was this lady? Florence Nightingale. So Florence Nightingale was so impressed with her writings that she would give them to the soldiers to encourage them. How amazing. This is Elizabeth Cotton. This is Lady Hope. So the only disapproval that she really had, or where she was criticized, was a woman sharing the gospel and not feeding men beer at the coffee house. He's basically saying, would you deprive working men of beer? And she was so totally convinced of abstinence of alcohol, basically saying, no, we're not going to have alcohol, because she saw the dangers of it. And she saw so many alcoholics, that were around, and knew she would not want to stumble them. Elizabeth had no fear. Even when she received death threats, she was not intimidated. She said, I'm not intimidated by the hooligans that might be going by bribes by the brewers and the publicans. Basically, she knew that the brewers and the publicans were bribing hooligans to come in and disrupt her coffee house because she wasn't serving alcohol. One time, a robber with a gun said, "If you scream, I'll blow your brains out." She said, "I'm not that sort of woman to scream." And she shared the gospel with him. That is pretty brave. And she would not avoid men, but shared Jesus with them. In fact, in the hospital visit, when soldiers came into the hospital or anyone else, she would go to their rooms and share Jesus. And she would touch their hand and hold their hand and say, "Would you like to give your heart to Jesus?" Especially if they were dying. And she'd always say, "You know that now is the accepted time. Today is the day of salvation." That was Elizabeth. That was her heart, Elizabeth Cotton's heart. She was greatly admired by everyone, especially the working men, as many had come to her coffee shop, to their coffee shop. And so they came in one time with some silver candlesticks. They all had gone in and bought these silver candlesticks just for her. And so as they came in and gave them to her, she put them down and she hugged them, and she had them all singing hymns. All those men singing hymns with her. That was Elizabeth. And December 6th, 1877, she married Admiral Sir James Hope in Dorking. She married him. And what about Admiral Hope? Sir Hope, so he was anointed Admiral Sir James Hope. So he was a very distinguished naval officer. He was the commander of the battleship at Trafalgar, a very important battle. And he served in the Crimean War on the HMS Majestic. He was severely wounded on 2 occasions, and he was a naval aide directly to who? Queen Victoria. He was a devout Christian and a temperance advocate, meaning he was against, alcohol. And Elizabeth started many coffee rooms after she married him, and he loved her coffee rooms, and she spread the gospel everywhere. In fact, they called her now, her name wasn't Elizabeth Cotton anymore. It was Lady Hope, because her name now was Hope, was Elizabeth Hope. So they called her Lady Hope. Her husband was Sir James Hope. So of course it'd be natural to call her Lady Hope. This was her name, and it fit, they said, and wherever she went, they called her Lady Hope. So Admiral's health was not so good. So in 1880, he could not go and stand and see her speak much anymore. And in 1881, at 73, he died. And this brought her great sorrow because he really took care of her and loved her. And so she settled her affairs and she went to her parents and stayed with her parents. But she decided she needed to go back and resume her gospel evangelism. But first, she wanted to get some rest and relaxation and probably go and get fellowship with her friend, Mrs. Fegan, right? Fegan's mother from the Fegan letter, remember? And Mrs. Fegan invited her into her home. And that's where Emma comes and meets with Mrs. Fegan. Emma is Charles Darwin's wife. And so Charles Darwin's wife, and Darwin sent a message for Elizabeth, for Lady Hope, where she was Elizabeth Cotton, which he knew her, to come and give a message. He gave a message, he gave a message for her to come and visit him, which Elizabeth, I'm sure, did. Darwin was familiar with her father because her father had been involved in the deep cultivation of with earthworms, where you put earthworms in the water, or earthworms in the fertile land to fertilize the land more. And so her dad was involved in that. Elizabeth Cotton's dad was involved in that. So Darwin was familiar with her father, and he was familiar with her husband, and he was familiar with her. And so Darwin would hear her speak in the coffee house. In fact, Darwin had heard her before speak in the coffee house. And so he had really sent this letter to her to come and speak to him. And so, in fact, she possibly came to speak with Darwin, Charles Darwin, a few times. So that's all evident. And then Elizabeth's work with evangelists. So Elizabeth, she was involved with major evangelism work. I mean, major. In fact, she planned and organized the missions to come to the missions coming to do speaking engagements to come to England for who else other than D.L. Moody. So D.L. Moody knew Elizabeth, and she had planned all those times that D.L. Moody came to tour that she put that together in 1883 and to 1884. She was very active in taking the gospel to the slums of London. She looked at the children there. They were like children's in cupboard, she said, and women fighting. So she made sure that they would have some place to go. And she helped in the women's and the children's ministry there. And then she also was active in the accommodations for homeless working men. In fact, up to 1,000 beds at night. She organized that they would have some place to sleep for homeless men, 1,000 beds a night. I'd say that's huge. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to go on because I don't want to go that long, and I wanted to end up and going into the last part of her life, which is almost more amazing than the first part of her life.